The soft hum of conversation filled the living room as the rest of the family gathered around the dining table. The atmosphere was warm, lively, and utterly ordinary, the way family dinners always were. But to me, everything felt heightened. Every sound, every movement, every glance, especially his. Aidan sat across from me, his hand casually wrapped around a glass of wine, his eyes scanning the room with ease. He looked effortlessly composed, his shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up just enough to show the strong lines of his forearms. It was a casual look, one that shouldn't have been significant. And yet it was. We weren't brothers by blood, and yet the word stepbrother carried enough weight to keep me rooted in place, my thoughts swirling as I tried to focus on anything but the way his gaze lingered on me. Dinner carried on in its usual rhythm, jokes exchanged, stories told, but I was barely present. I felt trapped under the weight of my own thoughts, caught between the impossibility of what I felt and the growing tension I couldn't seem to ignore. It wasn't until much later, when the others had retired for the night, that I found myself alone with Aidan. The quiet of the house was a stark contrast to the earlier noise, the silence amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat as he stepped into the dimly lit kitchen. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I turned, clutching the edge of the counter as I nodded. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." Aidan leaned against the doorway, his eyes catching the faint light as they locked onto mine. "You've been quiet all night. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, too quickly. "I've just been tired. Long day." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze unwavering as if he could see through the words I wasn't saying. Finally, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You know you don't have to keep things bottled up, right? If something's on your mind, you can tell me." The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and I felt the knot in my chest tighten. "It's nothing," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Aidan stopped a few feet away, his head tilting slightly as he studied me. "It doesn't seem like nothing." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked down, my grip tightening on the counter as I tried to steady myself. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and the space between us charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. He stepped closer, and I felt the heat of his presence before I looked up. His expression was unreadable, his gaze searching mine as though trying to decipher the thoughts I was too afraid to say out loud. "Liam," he said softly, my name rolling off his tongue in a way that made my chest ache. "If I'm crossing a line, just say so." His words hung in the air, heavy and fragile, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. I should have said something, should have stopped him. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen as he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was fleeting, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. Aidan's hand lingered just a moment longer before he pulled back, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. The tension between us was electric, an unspoken current that neither of us seemed able, or willing, to break. I felt every nerve in my body ignite as he stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne filling the space between us. "Liam," he said again, his voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "If this is too much, if I'm wrong, you just have to say the word." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind screamed at me to step away, to defuse the moment before it could spiral into something neither of us could take back. But my body refused to listen, every part of me rooted in place as I met his gaze. "You're not wrong," I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. Aidan's expression shifted, the faintest hint of relief flickering across his face. He took another step closer, the warmth of his body brushing against mine as his hand moved to my jaw, his touch feather light. I felt my breath hitch, my heart racing as his thumb traced a line along my cheekbone. "I've been holding this back for so long," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I can't pretend anymore." My chest tightened at his words, the raw honesty in his tone cutting through every wall I'd built around myself. "Neither can I," said, my voice trembling. That was all the encouragement he needed. Slowly, as if giving me every chance to pull away, Aiden leaned in. When his lips finally met mine, the world seemed to tilt, the air around us crackling with intensity. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the boundaries we'd just crossed, but as I responded, it deepened, the weight of everything we'd held back spilling into the moment. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in the fabric of his shirt. The counter pressed against my back, grounding me as I melted into him, the sensation of his lips on mine overwhelming and all-consuming. Every touch, every movement felt electric, and I couldn't get enough. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads resting together, I struggled to catch my breath. Aiden's hands remained on my waist, steadying me as his eyes searched mine. "We shouldn't be doing this," I said, my voice shaky but lacking conviction. "I know," he replied, his tone steady but full of emotion. "But I don't regret it." "Do you?" I shook my head, the truth settling over me like a weight I couldn't ignore. "No," I said softly. "I don't." Aiden's lips curved into a faint smile, his thumb brushing against my jawline. "Then we'll figure it out," he said, his voice resolute. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken truths. Aiden and I danced around each other, careful not to draw attention from the rest of the family but unable to resist the pull that kept drawing us closer. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine, sent a thrill through me that I couldn't suppress. At night, when the house was quiet, we found solace in each other's company. Sitting on the porch under the stars or stealing moments in the kitchen, we spoke in whispers, the weight of our connection hanging heavily in the air. One evening, as a thunderstorm raged outside, we found ourselves alone in the living room. The power had gone out, and the flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows across the walls. Aiden sat beside me on the couch, his presence a comfort as the rain pelted against the windows. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low. "Just thinking," I replied, my gaze fixed on the candle's flame. "About us?" he asked, his tone laced with both curiosity and caution. I hesitated, unsure how to put my thoughts into words. "About everything," I admitted. "How we got here. What it all means." Aiden shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine. "It means we care about each other," he said simply. "Maybe more than we should, but that doesn't make it any less real." His words sent a shiver through me, and I turned to face him, the dim light casting his features in soft relief. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There are so many reasons this shouldn't work." "And yet, here we are," he replied, his hand moving to cup my cheek. "Doesn't that count for something?" I couldn't argue with him, not when every part of me was screaming for him to close the distance between us. And when he did, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tender and insistent, I knew there was no going back. Aiden's kiss deepened, his hands sliding to my waist and pulling me closer as the storm outside seemed to mirror the intensity building between us. The sound of rain pounding against the windows and thunder rumbling in the distance faded into the background, leaving only the heat of his body pressed against mine and the rhythm of our breaths mingling in the dim light. I clung to him, my hands slipping up to tangle in his hair, as if anchoring myself to the moment. His touch was both careful and urgent, like he was holding something precious while teetering on the edge of restraint. When his lips left mine, trailing a line down my jaw to the hollow of my throat, I felt a shiver course through me, leaving no doubt about how deeply he affected me. "Aiden," I murmured, his name barely audible above the sound of my heartbeat. "What are we doing?" His movements stilled, and he lifted his head to meet my gaze. The intensity in his eyes sent a wave of heat through me, but there was also vulnerability there, a quiet plea for understanding. "We're being honest," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my cheek. For the first time, we're not hiding what we feel. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at the rawness of his words. "And what happens when this all comes crashing down?" I asked, my voice trembling. "When someone finds out? When it gets too complicated?" Aiden's expression softened and he pressed his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "We take it one day at a time," he said. "We figure it out as we go. But right now, all I know is that I don't want to let this go. I don't want to let you go." His words left me speechless, and before I could respond, he kissed me again, this time slower, deeper, as if trying to reassure me without words. The tension that had been simmering between us for weeks finally broke, spilling over in a rush of emotion and need that neither of us could control. Aiden's hands moved to my back, guiding me closer until there was no space left between us. I felt the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of my shirt, the steady beat of his heart matching my own frantic rhythm. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, a release of everything we'd been holding back. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, the reality of what had just happened settled over us. Aiden rested his forehead against mine, his hands still resting on my waist as his eyes searched mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, though my mind was still spinning. "I'm okay," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I didn't expect this." "Neither did I," he admitted, a small, self-deprecating smile tugging at his lips. "But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. Not anymore." His honesty was disarming, and I felt the last remnants of my resistance crumble. "Then let's not pretend," I said, surprising even myself with the boldness of my words. Aiden's eyes darkened and he pulled me into another kiss, this one slower, more deliberate. His hands moved to cradle my face, his touch firm yet gentle as if grounding me in the moment. I melted into him, my hands clutching his shirt as I let myself get lost in the feeling of being so completely seen and wanted. The days that followed were a delicate balance of stolen moments and cautious glances, each one more charged than the last. At family gatherings we kept our distance, careful not to draw attention, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every touch, every lingering glance felt like a secret shared only between us, a fragile thread that tied us together in ways words couldn't capture. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the rest of the world had faded away, we found solace in each other. In those stolen hours we let ourselves be vulnerable, exploring the depth of our connection without the fear of judgment. We talked about everything, our dreams, our fears, the weight of what we were doing, and every conversation only deepened the bond we shared. One night, as we sat on the back porch watching the stars, Aiden reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The simplicity of the gesture sent a wave of warmth through me, and I turned to look at him, the soft light from the house casting his features in shadow. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "All the time," he admitted, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. "But I don't have all the answers. I just know I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." His words settled over me like a weight, and I felt my chest tighten with a mix of fear and longing. "I don't want to lose you either," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's not easy." "Nothing worth having ever is," he said, his tone resolute. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The conviction in his voice steadied me, and I nodded, letting myself lean into the comfort of his presence. In that moment, I realized that no matter how complicated things got, I couldn't walk away from what we'd found. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, the delicate balance we'd created grew more fragile. Every moment we spent together felt heavier with unspoken truths and the weight of what we were doing. Aiden and I tried to act normal around the rest of the family, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. I caught myself stealing glances at him during dinners, lingering in the room a second longer when we passed each other in the hall, and replaying every word and every touch in my mind. It all came to a head one night when the family had gone out for the evening, leaving the house eerily quiet. I was sitting on the couch flipping aimlessly through channels when Aiden walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, watching me. The air between us was thick, the silence deafening as he finally crossed the room and sat down beside me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but steady. "I haven't," I replied too quickly, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Aiden turned to face me, his expression serious. "You don't have to lie, Liam. I can feel it. Ever since that night, you've been pulling away." I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm just trying to figure this out," I admitted. "It's not easy, Aiden. Every time I look at you, I feel like I'm drowning in everything I'm not supposed to feel." "And what do you feel?" he asked, his voice softer now. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I forced myself to look up. His eyes were steady, filled with a vulnerability that made my chest ache. "I feel like I can't stay away from you," I said quietly, "no matter how hard I try." Aiden's jaw tightened and he reached out, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me and I felt the knot in my chest loosen just slightly. "Then don't," he said simply. "I don't care how complicated this is, Liam. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I need you." His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips finding his in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender. Aiden responded immediately, his hands sliding to my waist as he pulled me closer. The weight of everything we'd been holding back came rushing to the surface, and I let myself get lost in the intensity of the moment. We broke apart only when we were both breathless, our foreheads resting together as the reality of what we'd just done settled over us. "This can't just be a secret forever," I said, my voice trembling. Aiden cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want it to be," he said firmly. "But for now, let's just figure out us. One step at a time." I nodded, my heart pounding as I let myself believe, just for a moment, that we could make this work. That night marked a turning point. Aiden and I stopped pretending, at least with each other. We spent our nights talking, laughing, and holding each other in the quiet corners of the house. Each stolen moment felt like a lifeline, a reminder that no matter how messy or complicated our situation was, it was ours. But as much as I cherished those moments, the fear of what we were doing never fully left me. Every time someone looked at us a second too long or asked a question that felt too pointed, I felt the walls closing in. Aiden, ever steady, seemed unfazed, always finding ways to ground me with a touch, a glance, or a quiet word of reassurance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house settled into its usual stillness, Aiden found me sitting on the porch, staring out at the fading light. He sat down beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he handed me a cup of tea. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice soft. "Just thinking," I replied, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "About us. About where this is going." "And what have you decided?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. I turned to look at him, the faint light casting his features in shadow. "That I don't want to lose this," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I don't want it without you." Aiden's expression softened, and he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. "Together." The simplicity of his words settled over me, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen just slightly. In that moment, I realized that no matter how complicated things got, no matter what challenges we faced, I wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough.